Whew. To quote Britney Spears, hey, is this thing on? Well, that's a terribly dark way to open up the show. Um, yes, the Golden Stallion, the man of tomorrow, Savzu, the rated R radio star, here with you. Did I get the right camera? Yeah. All right. The mood and everything, it's nice and dark here in the BDSM studio, and also it looks like Ice Planet Zero outside when it shouldn't in this time of year. But regardless of all that, I have a subject I want to get into that I don't get to talk about much anymore. That being Star Trek. I don't talk about it much anymore. Well, for a few reasons. One is I don't exactly do Sovryn Tech anymore, which it used to be a kind of a prerequisite to quote Star Trek at some point in any episode of Sovryn Tech. That was like, I mean, it wasn't a rule, but it just always happened. And the reason for that is that for most of my life, and honestly, even to this day in 2026, I've said this on Sexoterica before, I don't know where Star Trek ends and Brian Sovryn begins. I can't separate the two in any meaningful way. You know, it's like the episode The Enemy Within, right? Like there's the good side and the bad side of Captain Kirk. There's these two halves. And in such a real sense that is impossible to quantify. Like there's this half of me that is just that it's all Star Trek. So now part of the reason that I don't talk about Star Trek so much is that I've felt it important, as we've talked about in many recent episodes, to talk about the mystical and the occult and the spiritual side of matters. Now, I think a lot of people would say, you know, and certainly even me many years ago would have said, well, yeah, if you're talking about spirituality, the occult and mysticism, you don't talk about Star Trek. You know? Star Trek has nothing to do with any of that. Star Trek is, you know, it might not always be hard science fiction, but it's always hard atheism. And part of what I'm going to discuss in this episode is that is not true. And Star Trek is very much, is as much mystical as it is science. And there's a lot more I want to talk about with that. Yeah, we're going to talk about how new Star Trek sucks and, you know, how, you know, it would seem, and quite mercifully and thankfully, Star Trek appears to be dead again. And I am so grateful for that. Okay. Sometimes being a corpse is the best way to live. Sorry, that's a complete bastardization out of the Book of Zohar, but I'm gonna, a quote out of the Book of Zohar, but we're gonna run with it. But we're going to explore that. We're going to excise some demons, perhaps even literally, here in talking about this. So we have a lot to get into. I am going to read from a story that actually was part of the inspiration for this episode, not the fact that somehow, and I didn't even really think about it, that I'm actually recording this on First Contact Day, of course, which, you know, Star Trek sweaties will know very well from the, you know, which was based upon the phenomenal movie Star Trek First Contact. But I'll be reading a story that started all this, but also I think I'm going to have to read almost an entire chapter out of a very specific book, a book that I don't hear a lot of Star Trek fans talk about, unfortunately. Just to make my point, to get a point across. Okay. So I want you to buckle in. All right. Or, you know, like in Star Trek The Motion Picture, when Captain Kirk does this really cool thing with the captain's chair, and he actually like the armrests of it like pull down to be like like you know, to where it fastens him down to the to the captain's chair, which is great. When, you know, previously to that there was only the original series. Well, I guess there was also the animated series, which is so goddamn good. Yes, it is. Stop it. It's great. Okay. But you know, when you see Kirk just getting lunged across the bridge so many times, or holding on for dear life to that beautiful giant captain's chair in the original series, in what I would argue maybe the best looking Enterprise of all time. I know there's people who are going to disagree with me, but you know, I never totally bought into the Radisson in space. I mean, the Enterprise D. No, it's a great ship. It's a kick-ass ship. I love them all, baby. You understand? Okay. The best one's the Excelsior class anyway. So, okay. I'm all over the place here. Look, we got to get into the story. Look, the reality is, so of course we've had the recent acquisition or merging, right? You know, we have the Paramount deal that's going on with David Ellison, son of Larry Ellison. That shouldn't terrify anybody, but of course, this isn't the first rodeo with Star Trek running into varying degrees of trouble due to the rights of Star Trek either being split or being held by multiple companies or whatever's going on. You know, we can think of the old Viacom days, you know, in CBS Paramount, where Paramount was allowed to make movies, CBS was allowed to make TV series. Neither the twain shall meet. That was the state of Star Trek for a good while, and led to, or kept, I would argue kept really great things from happening, but that's besides the point. We still got the only halfway decent scene out of Star Trek Nemesis with, you know, Admiral Janeway, thankfully. Actually, okay, look, Nemesis isn't like great, but there's a lot of cool shit in it, and not just that one scene, even though I dig it. Okay. Look, bottom line, Star Trek has been a shit show since 2017. And a lot of us, you know, hardcore Star Trek fans that have been around for a few decades, maybe not since the original series, but, you know, who'd certainly been around since The Next Generation was, you know, originally airing on TV as of 1987. Granted, I was 6 years old, but I remember it better than you could believe. I'm gonna try to not. I mean, at some points, I'm going to have to talk about, you know, more of my personal experience with Star Trek throughout this, but I'm going to try to refrain from recovering a lot of ground that a lot of, you know, Sovryn Tech fans have already heard me talk about, you know, a billion times. Okay, but you know, we tried. The fans that have been around for a few decades, we tried to like, okay, you know, we'll work through it. We know Star Trek sometimes can have some rough patches. Okay, we'll sit through this. Yeah, first seasons aren't always the best. They're not always the worst. No, they're not. Even though some would claim that they are, that's just fucking not true. We'll try and stick through this with Discovery. We'll try and stick through this with Picard. We'll try and stick through whatever, you know, I mean, and just like with what's happening with Star Wars lately, like it just gets to a point where, well, to quote Star Trek, to quote Scotty of all things, you know, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And we're tired of getting fooled a gazillion times, because then, you know, how much does the shame build on oneself? I mean, still shame on them. Still shame on Alex Kurtzman all the way, right? So, you know, it honestly, it really didn't take long, I think, for a lot of the hardcore Star Trek fans to realize our franchise is just in a complete mess. It's being mishandled by complete fucking morons, you know, and we're just done with it. And I think we now, in postmortem, you know, and part of the reason that I think some of the stories can come out now around the reality of what gets, you know, unaffectionately called New Trek. I think a lot of that can come out now because of, you know, this present deal with David Ellison. So, and one of the stories that really struck me recently, now granted, this absolutely, it's from IGN, okay? We'll try not to hold it against it. Part of the reason that the story was done was to be promotional for the movie based upon Andy Weir's book, Project Hail Mary, okay, starring Ryan Gosling. The movie stars Ryan Gosling. It'd be weird if the book did, because there's no appeal to that guy outside of his looks, and even that I find quite debatable. Now, granted, I say that as an incredibly ugly person, but really, I love men, and he's just one of those men I do not love. Like by no means. I mean, no one's going to be William Shatner or, the Heartbreak Kid Shawn Michaels, but, Ryan Gosling could even try, and he doesn't succeed there. Regardless, we're getting off track. So clearly this story is more about promoting Project Hail Mary with science fiction fans, maybe trying to garner some sympathy with science fiction fans by, basically laying out that Andy Weir is, quote unquote, one of us, right? Which I think he is. I think he is a hardcore science fiction fan. I'm not debating that. Okay. But that he's like you, the, aging male population of science fiction fans that are supposed to want to go see Project Hail Mary, along with everybody that gets hot and bothered, unfortunately, like I said, about Ryan Gosling. Like it's a way, it's marketing to get you to go and see this movie. So I understand that that's what this piece is about. And the parts with Andy Weir are interesting, and I'm going to talk about them. And there's value in that, but the real value actually comes in a bit of the press release at the end. Okay. That is absolutely not marketing for Project Hail Mary. I mean, really, it isn't. Okay. For those asking, no, I have not seen Project Hail Mary. I am in no big rush to ever see anything with Ryan Gosling. And I'm also, it's not like I just go to see sequels, even though I did see, the Super Mario Galaxy movie, and I will be putting out a review of that because I think that movie deserves it. It's not like I just go to theaters, to see sequels all the time. I mean, that's a lot of what's put into theaters for financial reasons and ridiculous reasons that we all, are aware of. Okay. I love supporting original IPs. If this movie does money, Project Hail Mary, great. Again, I'm not really here to talk about that. The book was fine. It's just not, there's just parts of it that just don't sit right with me. And I'm sure the movie plays into a lot of that, even though I'm pretty sure some people whose opinions I generally respect in the sci-fi space, I think really love the movie. So whatever, maybe I'll check it out when it comes out on disc. Okay. How about that? Cause The Martian was good, both as a book and as a movie. Like I enjoyed that. The argument is that these are competence porn, which of course Star Trek certainly is, which, I mean, and I love that. Okay. And I guess that's a great lead in to actually reading the fucking story finally. Okay. So let's do that. So here we go from IGN. All right. And here's the headline. Quote, I'm a Trekkie. I would stay true to it, end quote. Project Hail Mary author Andy Weir reveals Paramount rejected his Star Trek pitch, says modern Star Trek shows, quote, are shit, end quote. And then the subline is, quote, it's gone, baby. It's all gone, end quote. Now, just from the headline and the subheader, yep, sure. Yes. Modern Star Trek shows are shit. Like I don't disagree at all. And it's gone, baby. It's all gone. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So let's read the story here. And this is from March 30th, 2026. So just for context, by Wesley Yin Poole. In the wake of the cancellation of the divisive Starfleet Academy, Project Hail Mary author Andy Weir has revealed Paramount rejected his pitch for a new Star Trek show and has called modern Star Trek, quote, shit, end quote. Star Trek is currently without a new announced series. The divisive Starfleet Academy set to end with its upcoming second season, and Star Trek Strange New Worlds set to end with its fifth season. Some objected to Star Trek Academy's progressiveness and Gen Z skewing nature, although others praised the show for these characteristics. Earlier this month, Starfleet Academy director Jonathan Frakes, who plays much-loved Star Trek character William Riker, told IGN that fan hate is, quote, dimensionally more painful, end quote, today than in the Next Generation years. Now, Stallion breaking in for a second. Okay. I have heard, this is, like second, third hand from insiders that because we never get like the actual streaming numbers unless they want to brag about them. Right. But then they have to be able to back them up. But we never hear the actual streaming numbers, even though all of these streaming services have incredibly exacting metrics, not just data, but metadata. Okay. Like they know how long you're resting the cursor or the, whatever your remote, wherever your remote selects, whatever we want to call that, the selection box. They know how long, and they keep this information. They know how long like you sat on something to consider watching it, not even whether or not you actually watched it. Of course, they know that. They have so much data, and they never share that with people, ever. But from an industry insider, the claim is that Starfleet Academy, that series, the entire series, which had 8 episodes maybe for the first season, the entire first season only had 400,000 views. Flat out. Who knows how many of that are doubles by just, I don't know. Look, I'm just going to say it, man. Like, if you thought that was Star Trek, you might enjoy that if like you're not into what actually Star Trek is about. We will talk about what Star Trek was actually about because I think everybody gets this wrong. Sure, you might have liked it that much. I don't know. If you enjoyed it as kind of a what if story, I guess that kind of person could exist. But holy fuck was this stuff? And I couldn't even get through the whole damn thing. This stuff was horrible. But 400,000 views. There are penny ante YouTube fucking videos that get more than one of those could get more than that. That's bad. That is really, 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 really bad. I cannot emphasize that enough if that's true. And regardless of this, merger happening, okay, which is also part of the reason that like, okay, yeah, why is Strange New Worlds ending? Because apparently there are Star Trek fans who do like that show. I still don't see the appeal to that. I mean, I see like some cool things here and there, but it's far from enough for me to say, yep, that's Star Trek. But why are these things getting canceled? And why isn't there anything new on the books, new announced series, something new in development? I mean, why aren't we getting a Section 31 series? Wow. Don't answer that question. I'm not going to tell you to go watch the fucking movie either. Holy hell. But this is because everything's in limbo with the deal right now, going on with Paramount. Like who knows? What's going to be on the chopping block and whatever else with all the stuff. And that's true for, Warner Brothers, whatever. Okay. So that's what's going on. All right. Now, I could say so much about Jonathan Frakes' comment that, like, oh yeah, fan hate is just, it's dimensionally more painful today than in the Next Generation years. There's so much I could say about this. I mean, yes, like I was there, even at 6 years old, I was there and I was well aware of, and you can actually find direct evidence for this. Okay. But I like documentary style evidence for this. I was well aware that there were so many fans who were like, Star Trek, the next generation, if it doesn't have Captain Kirk or Spock, it's not Star Trek. There were a lot of people who felt that way and were very, very hardcore and serious about that. And I can actually understand that opinion. As someone who these days more or less sees the original series, like in many ways still as like the pinnacle, right? I know that's kind of hard to believe. I mean, I think there are individual episodes of other Star Trek series that very much put on display like what Star Trek is really all about, perhaps better than the original series. And certainly there are episodes that, you know, like if I did a top 20 episodes of Star Trek of all time, it's not going to be all original series. There are absolutely going to be episodes from other series that would be on that list. But as far as the in some ways the purest expression of what Star Trek was about, the original series by and large got it right the most. Now, a part of this episode that I'm recording right now for you, we're going to explore why I say that. Okay, why that comes up. So, but let's keep going. So, bottom line, like Jonathan Frakes, like I don't really agree with this statement, because I remember there was an interview between actually Jonathan Frakes, Patrick Stewart, and William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy, where Patrick Stewart was incredibly reticent. He was almost like you could see it on the camera, where he was scared to say that he thought Gene Roddenberry had a closer relationship with the Next Generation crew and the actors than he did with the original series people. Now, this is demonstrably true. Like, Patrick Stewart's not lying here. Like, it's absolutely correct. And we have accounts to really prove the matter. Okay, because Gene Roddenberry was either not as much involved as people realize, even with the original series, or we know that he was often, like, Paramount was literally like locking him in his office on the Paramount lots to keep him from interfering with the production of the Star Trek movies, particularly the original series movies, right? Which during his lifetime were the only things that there were. So, like, and I mean, really, like, he would be sending memos to the set, but they wouldn't let him on set. Like, that's how uninvolved he was. Okay. And he wouldn't get re-involved until seasons 1 and 2 in particular, of the Next Generation, which ironically, even hardcore Star Trek fans will often say, well, those are the worst 2 seasons of the whole goddamn franchise. Truth to that? Well, we'll talk about that a little bit. I've talked about some of this stuff, in years past, but I guarantee you we're going to be deep diving so much more. You're going to learn things about Gene Roddenberry that I guarantee you most of you had no idea. I guarantee you most of you had no idea how nuts this guy was. And I don't necessarily mean that disparagingly, but in some ways I also do. So, Jonathan Frakes, like, the difference today is not that, I mean, it's more painful today in that it's more like you can see it. Like, fans have a better way of reaching you. Before, they had to, like, actually mail you a letter, and this is how much people cared about shit. They would actually take the time to put a stamp on that shit, raise the red flag on their mailbox, or take it right down to the post office to fucking make sure it got to Paramount Studios, whatever. People used to really care. Now, like, hate's easy today. That's kind of why I call bullshit on Johnny Frakes here. Okay, because hate's easy today. Just post it on fucking X. Done. Make a little video, but done. Like, it's nothing. It's nothing like the passion that people had years ago, where they had to actually get off their goddamn ass, deal with the U.S. government, as in the post office, which I know it's partly privatized, risked their lives and limb in front of, the postal worker who might go postal on them, might go nuts and open up an AR-15 on their asses, right? But that's how much they cared about Star Trek at the time. And Satan bless them for that. And I mean that. As to where today, I mean, most Star Trek fans, that haven't been the sweaties for decades that are online. I mean, I think most of them are bots anyway, just judging by what they write. Oh man. Okay. I'm going to reserve all comments on that. We got more to get into. We got to talk about this. Let's keep going. Okay. So going back to the story from IGN, Weir is an Andy Weir, right? Very like Andy Weir. All right. 1 second. Andy Weir is a breakout author. Okay. At a time when there aren't a lot of big names in science fiction authorship, that are still alive, let alone one that is like under 70 today. So Andy Weir is a breakout author, and his books, I would argue, some people would say, oh, they're, kind of flash in the pan or very surface level sci-fi or something like that. No, this guy is a real science fiction fan. You can tell. And, I think his books are actually pretty good, including Artemis. I didn't mind that at all. So, okay. Yeah, sure. It's not Asimov, but no one is. Okay. All right. Weir, reading the story, Weir is coming off the back of the hugely successful release of the Project Hail Mary movie starring Ryan Gosling. It's made over $300 million at the global box office after just 2 weekends in theaters, and there's even talk of a sequel should Weir himself get around to writing a follow-up. That's another big credit to Andy Weir, just breaking in for a second, is that, he hasn't fallen to sequelitis yet. Good for him. Again, I think in many ways, Andy Weir's heart is in the right place, and he is a hardcore science fiction fan. Okay. Reading on with the story, speaking on the Critical Drinker After Hours YouTube channel, Weir ended up talking about the state of Star Trek, which he was heavily influenced by. He said, all modern science fiction TV shows and movies have been heavily influenced by the original Star Trek, except for the current batch of Star Trek shows, before commenting on the end of Starfleet Academy. So let me read his quotes quick here. Okay, quote, "It's gone, baby. It's all gone," end quote. Weir said of the latest Star Trek series. Quote, "I saw a guy talking about," he said, "all modern science fiction has been influenced by the Gene Roddenberry Trek, except the modern Trek," end quote. Weir went on to give his opinion on recent Star Trek shows from Enterprise onwards. Quote, "I like Strange New Worlds. I think it's pretty good. I didn't hate Enterprise. I thought it was kind of weird. But Lower Decks, I thought was entertaining and fun. All the others, they can go," end quote. So it's kind of odd that he loops in Enterprise in that. Like, Enterprise is Roddenberry Trek. I'm not saying it's not the least of shows, but, as I used to say about Star Trek, which was true all the way up to 2017 before Star Trek Discovery was released, any hour of Star Trek is better than any other hour of anything else. So even the least hour, the least great hour of Star Trek is still better than anything else made, except for Babylon 5. That's my caveat, because nothing's better than that. But so it's kind of weird that he brings Enterprise in on that. Lower Decks, I don't get his point. Entertaining and fun. Okay, maybe at times. Strange New Worlds, again, I don't see the appeal there. The only thing that show had going for it was Anson Mount, but even then, what did they do with the character? What did they do with Spock? All these things where I think it all got fucked up. Okay. So I'm not with him on that, but he's open. He's well to have his opinions. And the idea that all modern science fiction is influenced by Star Trek. Abso-fucking-lutely. Absolutely. Not just science fiction. We cannot, it's almost an impossible task, in my opinion, to overstate the influence of Star Trek, not just on science fiction, on everything. And I don't just mean entertainment. I mean everything. The technological hellscape that we exist in right now, Star Trek. Influenced the whole thing. Did it create it? Did it lead to all this? No, I wouldn't argue that. And the reason I wouldn't argue that is because Star Trek's ideals, were antithetical to a surveillance state. Really. Okay. Now you can point out things here and there where, oh no, but you see, they could tell this guy's heart rate and the sensors can always locate where this person is or things like, look, you're in Starfleet. Of course they can. And that probably comes with the job description, and really it should. It's wait, is this guy making some deal with the Klingons, with the, with Lursa and B'Etor over there? What the fuck's going on? There's nothing wrong with that. Now, if they're spying on every little fucking person on every planet, how can you even, when you become a galactic civilization, even just between a couple of quadrants, when you become a galactic civilization, like you can't even have, even with, subspace speeds of sending communications and whatever else, like you literally, you cannot surveil an entire civilization or like an entire species under those conditions. It's not possible. So stop it. Okay. Yeah. Star Trek's done a lot of harm as much as it's done good. Like, but it's easily at least 50-50, if not more. It's done more good. Okay. But I'll be the first to admit that, yeah, it has problems. And well, actually, again, we're going to get into some of that. So yes, like it's a funny comment to make that basically like all of science fiction is all modern science fiction is influenced by Star Trek, except for New Star Trek. Because New Star Trek has nothing to do with original Star Trek. I agree with him, but it's a lot worse than that. And it's not because like, oh yeah, all the woke people or what. No, shut up. That doesn't matter. Okay. There's nothing to even talk about really there. Too many people do. And it's a fucking facade. I'm going to show you how confused these fucking people are. Okay. And it has nothing to do with wokeness. Reading the story, Weir went on to give his opinion on recent Star Trek shows from Enterprise onwards. Oh, all right. We already read that part. Let's keep going. Enterprise came out in 2001 and ended in 2005. There was a huge 12-year gap before Discovery came out in 2017. Why they're not mentioning the Star Trek movies? Like the Jar Jar Abrams films. I don't know why. Because we actually had Star Trek in 2009. Was it 2013 and then 2016? And I know a lot of people don't like those movies. I enjoyed those. And they were respectful to the overall Roddenberry canon, if we're to call it that. Okay. Star Trek Beyond in 2016 was an absolute high note. And the comic books that IDW was coming out, continuing that storyline with, with Kirk and the whole crew on the USS, or most of the crew on the USS Endeavor. Fucking awesome. Awesome. I think I gave it, like on Sovryn Tech, I gave it comic book of the year. It was so good. But again, you've got people that are sweaties, and then you've got, I don't know, people that just need to do something other than listen to their wife. That's how they feel, I guess. Like they just don't want to be annoyed by their wife and kids, and so they get a distraction and they're not actually invested in what's going on. I don't know. Whatever. Sorry, if I just made fun of somebody, well, that's on you, buddy. It hurt you, not me. Okay, so yeah, it's very odd that this IGN story like completely negates that in that paragraph, because we did not have it was not a dearth of Star Trek. There was actually, again, it wasn't just the movies. You had books and comic books coming out quite regularly within all of this, but okay, reading on. There was a huge 12-year gap before Discovery came out in 2017. That sparked something of an explosion of Star Trek TV shows led by current Star Trek boss Alex Kurtzman, which included Picard and Lower Decks in 2020, Prodigy in 2021, Strange New Worlds in 2022, and Starfleet Academy this year. Now, I want to break in a bit on that. Like, Alex Kurtzman was not the guy really running season 1 of Discovery. Okay. In fact, I have to admit, I am spacing on the man and woman duo that was running things at the time, but they got fired. Like they were kicked out after season 1 because it was such a fucking mess. And then Kurtzman said that he was stepping in, with the bigger role. I mean, at the time, I want to be clear on this. At the time, part of the reason that myself and I think a lot of other Star Trek fans were feeling pretty confident about Star Trek Discovery, were like, yeah, we'll give this a chance, was actually due to one name, and it was not Alex Kurtzman, because Kurtzman's record at that point was not great. I mean, now it's completely, just like Jar Jar Abrams, it's completely in the gutter. But at the time, he was still coming off of Spider-Man flops and all kinds of things. But I wasn't that worried about him, because the name that I cared about was Kirsten Beyer. Kirsten Byers, so she was the author and kind of the lead mind, as my understanding goes, of the relaunch that Simon and Schuster did of their Star Trek novel series in 2005, where they're kind of creating this like post Star Trek Nemesis, cohesive story, like cohesive whole. Like you get new kinds of like quantum slipstream, propulsion technology that superseded warp drive. That became part of a major storyline. Like, and everybody agreed, okay, now this exists. They did cool things with the Earth Romulan War for, they happened after Enterprise ended. And she was doing great stuff with the Voyager, with Voyager in particular, with that series. She's awesome. She was absolutely awesome. And because she was on the writing team, I mean, like really, I couldn't care less about Akiva Goldsman, but because she was on the writing team, we're like, okay, somebody in there like really knows their shit and provably understands Star Trek at a deep level. But I don't know if her voice got drowned out or what, because I did not see her influence on these shows whatsoever. And I don't know what's up with her right now, because I haven't cared about Star Trek. I care about the Star Trek of yore, but Star Trek of today, I haven't cared about that in years. Again, that's partly why I don't talk about it anymore, because I don't want to be confused as someone who likes this crap, this excrement that gets levied on people. So, reading on with the story. At this point in the interview, Weir claimed Paramount rejected his Star Trek show pitch, although he didn't say that what it would have involved. At this point, he called modern Star Trek shows shit, and to Paramount declared, quote, we're quoting, "fuck 'em," end quote. Quote, and here's another thing. Boy, you can tell when somebody's mad, right? When they start doing that. And another thing. Quote, and here's another thing. So I pitched a Star Trek show to Paramount, and I was in a Zoom meeting, I guess, with the showrunners of all of the shows. And I'm just like pitching them my show idea. And so I actually spent a long time talking to Alex Kurtzman. I don't like a lot of the new Trek, but I have to say he as a person is a really nice guy. So it's kind of interesting. I feel a little bad for him, but at the same time, those shows are shit. He is a nice guy, but they didn't accept my pitch. So, fuck him. No, I don't know. And he laughs, end quote. The suggestion throughout all of this is that Weir would do a much better job than Kurtzman at running Star Trek. Or at least the shows would go down better with fans. Quote, I'm a Trekkie. I would stay true to it. End quote, Weir said, before suggesting Star Trek and other long-running sci-fi franchises like it suffer from studio interference. Quote, for the major properties like Star Trek, Star Wars, you're always going to get studio interference. And one thing that I have to say on Project Hail Mary, Amazon is new to the game, and there was I can't even think of any studio. I mean, they gave notes on the cuts and stuff like that, but they weren't up in our faces pushing us around. And that's happening on the Star Wars films and stuff like that. I think part of the reason why Project Hail Mary ended up being such a good movie, I'm incredibly biased, but whatever, is because the studio just let the artistic people do their job. They let Phil Lord and Chris Miller be directors and have control. And they didn't come in and get in the way and say, quote, no, change this, no, do that, end quote, because it's not some 50-year-old legacy franchise that they want to do things with, end quote. So, wow, there's so much to unpack within that. Of course, it's very interesting with Project Hail Mary. Look, Lord and Miller are two very talented fellows. Okay, so in some sense, I'm not surprised that at the very least, Project Hail Mary is a very passable film. Like, it's not a complete waste of time. Okay, it might even be good. I'll reserve judgment. Okay. It's interesting. Lord and Miller, of course, famously were originally the filmmakers behind Star Wars or Solo, a Star Wars story. And in fact, as I remember it, okay, because I also don't follow Star Wars at all anymore, because it's in the same boat as Star Trek in my book. Really, I know I'm going to have to get forced and they're going to drag me. Like Ellen and my brother Robin Freebeard, I know they're literally going to have to drag me into the movie theater to see The Mandalorian and Grogu. I told them, and because we've gone to movies quite a few times, and every time that trailer, because there aren't that many movies coming out. In fact, it's so weird during the Mario Galaxy movie. I know I'm going on 20 different stories here. On the Mario Galaxy movie, all of the trailers before the film were all Disney movies, but the Mario Galaxy movie is made by like Universal and Illumination and Nintendo. Like, they're direct competitors. In fact, I know that Disney hates Nintendo. Hates them. Especially because, like, Nintendo's making all this, you know, they're printing money with their franchises, as to where Disney is, you know, like tanking, you know, like faster than the Titanic. Or is it Ocean Gate? All right. That was a bad one. So, so my point is, like, there's not a whole, who's even like putting movies in theaters anymore? Like, I wasn't surprised that it was a bunch of Disney movies that were being promoted. I mean, granted, like, how many movie studios are there out there anyway that are independent, or, you know, that could be a competitor to Disney, since Disney owns almost everything, not everything, but almost. You know, I'm not surprised that there were like a bunch of Disney trailers ahead of the film. It was just like, wow, what the fuck? So anyway, any movie you go to, doesn't matter if you want to support Disney or not, you're going to encounter Disney's properties. You can't fucking avoid it. And the Mandalorian Grogu trailer keeps coming up. And yep, I laugh at the, you know, like, nice shot, baby, or whatever. But otherwise, I just don't care. And I love Sigourney Weaver, but I just don't care. And I said to them, it wasn't at the Mario movie, it was at another one. I was like, I'm not giving that any money. I'm just not going to. Okay? Like, I'm not going to it. I don't, and in fact, I would never watch it. There are many hours, say nothing of books and comic books, of which I used to read them all. People who've been listening to me for many years know that score. There's many hours of Star Wars that I have not consumed, and I have no intention to ever do so. I just don't care anymore. And it's not that I've grown up. It's that they've grown out. And to what, I don't know. Some wild bastardization. But anyway, I'm not going to give that movie money. But where was I going with this? This is what happens when you get lost on shit. Okay? But speaking of Disney's failures, that's where I was going. Lord and Miller, okay, who made Project Hail Mary, Lord and Miller, talented fellows, originally made Solo a Star Wars story. Now, again, as I remember it from back in the day with Star Wars, this is what I was saying, is they actually made that entire movie, more or less. And they had to reshoot the thing because they brought in Ron Howard. Because Disney didn't like what Lord and Miller were making. So, like, the point that Andy Weir is making here, that like Amazon Studios, yeah, it's not a franchise, so they didn't give a shit. They didn't pay any attention to it. Like, yeah, this is pretty seemingly verifiable. And I'm sure Lord and Miller loved it. Like, hey, we're not going to make this movie if you bother us. So I imagine there were some contract stipulations in there, considering what they had to deal with you know, Kathleen Kennedy. You know, make it gay, make it lame. So, I mean, I'm glad these guys are doing the business and getting work, you know, make no mistake. Okay. But yeah, but this is a real problem, is that you do have studios who are like, okay, no. Our franchises that we own, these are 100-year plans. And, you know, you can't fuck with that. We don't care what your name is, because you'll be dead in 20 years, but our franchise has to live on. Otherwise, we don't, you know, have any money to pay to all the debtors that we've owed for, you know, over 150 years. So, great, you know, and look, as far as Andy Weir, do I think he'd make a better Star Trek if he was left alone to write it and run it? Yeah, I think he would. And I think, in fact, the fact that Paramount said, no, fuck you, we're not running with your idea, whatever that idea was. And there's nothing weird about him not telling the idea, because you run into the issue where, like, you know, for example, with the Stargate franchise, which of course is coming back, and I am not even cautiously optimistic, but we'll see. Okay. We'll see what happens. I mean, I'm ready. I want it, but I don't know. Hopefully this is a good sign that Amazon, because Amazon is in charge of that now, maybe Amazon will leave it alone, but I don't know. It's a big franchise. But with Stargate, right, you have the showrunners of Stargate, who, with Stargate Universe, great show, truly. Okay. they know what they planned for, to resolve the cliffhanger at the end of season 2. They have never really told anybody what that is. And part of the reason is that, like, they may get to use it someday, and they don't want somebody to take their idea and run with it and get paid for it when it was their idea and they want to get brought in, to make it, stuff like that. Like, there's reasons that creatives don't share their great ideas. And this actually happens both ways. Of course, J. Michael Straczynski is near infamous for having fans, like, telling fans of Babylon 5, don't tell me your fan fiction ideas. Don't tell me your story. I don't want story ideas. Because what'll happen is, and this did happen to him as I understand it, is someone will tell him a story idea. Then an episode that he makes will actually be similar to the story idea by the fan. And then the fan sues him saying, you took my idea. Okay. So, like, the secrecy around ideas, there's legal precedent for that. I think that's horseshit because I don't believe in IP, but I get it. Okay, so it's not weird that Andy Weir didn't, tell us what his story idea was. But regardless, Paramount rejected it. I imagine his idea was very Roddenberry, or quote unquote Roddenberry. I put that in quotes for a reason, but very quote unquote Roddenberry Star Trek. Very old school, shall we say, Star Trek. And that's why it got shot down. I can absolutely believe that. So, in a tangential way, we're pretty much, it's implied here very heavily that, yeah, Paramount doesn't care about real Star Trek. Like, they're actively opposed to Star Trek, because why wouldn't you take a bankable name like Andy Weir, which, again, Amazon recognized it. That's why Project Hail Mary got made. That's why Lord and Miller got involved. That's, because it's bankable. The Martian's a fucking hit. His books sell like gangbusters, right? Like I said, he's a breakout author, the real deal. Almost a seasoned veteran by book 3. Or however, was he done short story? Whatever. You get my point. Like, yes, you absolutely would say, yep, we're bringing in Andy Weir to make a Star Trek show. Like, you would just do that. It makes financial sense, but it is against whatever agendas Paramount has. And this was, and as best as I can tell, this conversation was well before, like any David Ellison deals were being put down. Okay. And I definitely would have liked to have seen what he did with it. I mean, who knows? Maybe it would have sucked, but he at least got the competence porn part down, or I think he would have had that down. And in some ways that might be the most important thing. So anyway, again, this isn't really the primary focus of what I want to talk about. But it's just, it's vindicating. Right. And again, I'm like, the idea that there's no new Star Trek getting made, this shouldn't be the reality. But for me, like, that just makes me so happy, just like with Babylon 5, I know J. Michael Straczynski was so excited about getting to remake Babylon 5 and everything, but I've said this over and over again, like, don't do it. Just let it be. Okay. A story can end. That's all right. And we even have great novels from that, and that's just as true as Star Trek. IDW is still making kick-ass comic books. Kick-ass comic books. That in my opinion, any Star Trek fan should be checking out. I mean, great stuff. You got fucking Scotty working with Captain Sisko, and yeah, I mean, like, all this great stuff that's going on there. Love it. So anyway, let's keep reading the IGN story here, because we're going to get into what I really want to get into. The future of Star Trek is very much up in the air following Paramount's successful bid for Warner Brothers. According to the Hollywood Reporter, Kurtzman's deal with CBS Studios runs until the end of 2026, and he's in talks with Paramount Plus about renewing or extending it. Steady breaking in. Of course he is. It's his paycheck, right? It's been his paycheck for 10 years. Almost 10 years. Earlier this month, Kurtzman said he'd had positive conversations with Paramount over the future of Star Trek. Quote, "Yes, we've gotten nothing but support," he told TrekMovie.com. "Yes, there have been specific shows that have been discussed, and we'll see. I'm truly at the beginning of the conversation with them now, and so I hesitate to say anything to you because I don't have anything to report yet. But I can report that the conversations are happening." End quote. Let me read this last part. However, this interview was conducted before the announced cancellation of Starfleet Academy, so it remains to be seen how relevant those talks were. Yeah, so Stelling breaking in on that. Okay, I want to mention quick, because I think I neglected to mention this earlier about Star Trek Discovery, is that the other reason we were really hopeful about Discovery was it Brian Fuller was also involved, of course, who had worked in Star Trek previously, another person who very much understood Star Trek, and was directly involved with the production back in the quote unquote good old days. They were also, they disappeared after the first couple episodes. And we know that some of the concepts for Star Trek Discovery were very different than what we ended up getting, right? Originally it was going to be like an anthology show where every season dealt with a different time frame and character, which could have been really cool. Like I would have been down, I mean, there's show, what is it? True Detective or something. I don't know, where they do similar things where like season 1 and season 2 aren't really related at all, and it's just an anthology show, whatever. I don't know. I really don't watch a lot of modern TV shows, so I couldn't say. But regardless, not a bad idea, particularly in 2017. But reading on with the story, because we're going to get into the good part, or the part that is more important to me, I should say. Following the series' demise, Kurtzman and executive producers Noga Landau and Gaia Violo issued an open letter published by Variety. So not exactly a press release, an open letter, they're calling it these days, to the cast and crew of Starfleet Academy. So here it is. This is published by Variety. This is quote unquote official. Okay. It's been my and Noga's joy and privilege to help carry Gene Roddenberry's extraordinary vision forward with Starfleet Academy. Thanks to the hundreds of hardworking humans who pour every ounce of their talents into the work daily with imagination and reverence. Okay, now I want to stop there for a second. I get it. You kind of have to say that, right? You kind of have to pay some kind of like lip service to the creator. Just like everybody in Star Wars is always appealing to George Lucas. Of course, the difference being George Lucas is still very much alive. But that phrase, to help carry Gene Roddenberry's extraordinary vision forward with Starfleet Academy, I don't think you understand Gene Roddenberry's vision. And not only that, is it really Gene Roddenberry's vision? These are the things we need to get into here, but I'm going to keep reading. Quote, we are in post-production now on what will be the second and final season, that's of Starfleet Academy. We're so proud of what we've accomplished together on the show, and the world will get to see the work of these extraordinary artists when season 2 airs. We will finish strong. Whether you're working on Star Trek or part of the marvel that is Star Trek fandom, its very heart, soul, and conscience, the joy comes from adventuring across boundaries of time, space, and the humanly possible in service to, here we go again, in service to Roddenberry's transformative vision of the future. That incomparable vision was fueled by an inexhaustible optimism. Star Trek places its bet on the best in human nature. It dares to imagine a society of, quote, infinite diversity and infinite combinations, end quote. Of course, that's the classic IDIC, right, of Vulcan philosophy. Free of war, hate, poverty, disease, and repression, and dedicated to the spirit of scientific inquiry and respect for all life, whether carbon or silicon-based, green-skinned or blue. Now, I'm not sure how many people I saw eating meat on New Trek, but excuse me, another bad one. Really, this, again, I'm going to go back on this. In service to Roddenberry's transformative vision of the future, that incomparable vision was fueled by an inexhaustible optimism. We're going to hold that statement in brackets, and we're going to get back to that. Because, quite frankly, and believe me, this pains me to say it, these are lies. These are lies. And I'm going to prove it to you. Yeah, I mean, they're lying about not being true to Roddenberry's Star Trek. And that, I mean, that's a lie. But I'm saying the idea of Roddenberry's vision itself is very much a lie. Again, I'm going to prove it to you. We're going to break it down. Keep reading, but make no mistake. Gene Roddenberry, holy shit. This is what blows my mind. They keep appealing to Gene Roddenberry, the great bird of the galaxy. And I understand that in the popular consciousness, there is this myth. And normally I treat myth with high regard, as in there's truth to it. But in this sense, I'm using myth the way most people use it, as in it's bullshit. It's like religion. Okay. It really, like, this whole statement, this is all mind blowing that they keep bringing in Gene Roddenberry when even the Gene Roddenberry, the popular consciousness, they are not putting on display on their show. Provably so. And there are so many people who've done videos about this. Even Andy Weir was basically saying it here, that these, the only thing not influenced by by Star Trek is modern Star Trek. Right. And that's basically saying, no, you don't get Roddenberry's vision. But then what was Roddenberry's vision? Well, again, we're going to get into that. Reading again, but make no mistake, Gene Roddenberry wasn't some starry-eyed dreamer. Okay, well, actually, that statement is true. He was a decorated Army bomber pilot in the Pacific Theater, also true. He had seen firsthand the grim consequences of the worst of human nature, also true. And his vision of the future wasn't just a promise of hope. It was also a warning. In a fraught, frightening time of intolerance and violence, Star Trek said, look, we made it, but just barely. First, we had to put all those ancient scourges behind us. It said that what makes us glorious as a species and gives us hope for the future and the galaxy is inextricably linked to what makes us dangerous to each other, to this one world we presently inhabit, and to ourselves. That dual message of hope and warning isn't just a pretty dream, but a call to action, to think about who we are in a different way. Please don't take our word for it. Take Gene's. And they're going to quote Gene Roddenberry here. And I'm going to read this, then I want to break that down a little bit more, and then we've got a lot more to get into here. This is from Gene. Quote, Star Trek was an attempt to say that humanity will reach maturity and wisdom on the day that it begins not just to tolerate, but take a special delight in differences, in ideas, and differences in life forms. If we cannot learn to actually enjoy those small differences, to take a positive delight in those small differences between our kind here on this planet, then we do not deserve to go out into space and meet the diversity that is almost certainly out there. End quote. Now that quote, or let's see, let me finish this off. With enduring hope that his vision of the future is possible for our children, their children, and every future cadet in Starfleet Academy, live long and prosper. Okay. Fuck you, buddy. So that quote from Gene Roddenberry, you can actually, that's from a convention. And if you bought, this is back in the day, 2000, around the year 2000. So it was for the 20th anniversary of Star Trek: The Motion Picture, the greatest piece of Star Trek ever made, in my opinion. It was for the 20th anniversary of that, they released a special edition of the soundtrack for Star Trek: The Motion Picture on CD. Of course, I was there in line at FYE. The minute they opened up and had that on the shelves, I bought that shit so fast. I was a teenager, but I was there. Okay? More or less a teenager. The real 20th anniversary would have been 99, right? Maybe it was 99. Anyway, I was there. It had the nice holographic foil cover, and it was so cool. Okay, now, it was 2 discs. The second disc, the first disc was the soundtrack for Star Trek: The Motion Picture. The second disc was a CD release of a record, like a vinyl record that was released in the 70s called Inside Star Trek. This is an absolutely precious thing to have a copy of. Because in it, they do interviews with cast members, like Nichelle Nichols. I mean, everybody. And there's interviews with Roddenberry. Roddenberry's actually guiding the whole thing. It's kind of this really cool multimedia idea where it was basically like a documentary on a vinyl record. It's such a cool idea. They talked with Isaac Asimov on it, but on that, they actually do play where he said this. That you have to take, like, I can even hear his intonation, a special delight in differences in ideas, a special delight, in, like, he kept saying that. And And it's a powerful moment. And it's also the same, speech, I guess we'll say, where at a convention where he said that we had an idea that the person on the other side of the TV screen was not an idiot. And it really is such a powerful thing to say. Now, how much was that Gene Roddenberry's thinking, or was it somebody else's? Okay, there's debate to have around that. But it's a powerful statement to make for sure. Okay, and I don't want to take anything away from that, really, because ultimately, regardless of whose idea it was, who the real I don't want to say puppet master, but who the real great bird of the galaxy happens to be, regardless of any of that, the effects are real and are, like I said, overall positive. Okay? So, there's so much I can unpack with Kurtzman's apparent understanding of what Star Trek was saying. Now, he's not wrong in that Star Trek was both a message of hope and warning. A book that I'm going to quote a few times throughout this conversation that we're having is one by Yvonne Fern, which originally came out in 1994. It was, posthumous, right? Like it came out after Gene died. And there was a revised edition, which it's weird that there was a revised edition for this. It's called Star Trek, or it's called Gene Roddenberry, The Last Conversation. That's what it's called. And of course they put Star Trek in like the subheader title and all that, but regardless, it's Gene Roddenberry, The Last Conversation. And basically this woman, Yvonne Fern, like followed Gene Roddenberry around for like a year or so and was just tape recording all these conversations with him, having, meals with him, having lunch with him. He really enjoyed steak, even though, wait, what about all the enjoying the differences in life forms? I don't know, I guess animals or something else, but okay, moving right along. Excuse me. But it's a tremendous, mind-blowing read when you read this book. And part of what he talks about, and he said it before even than in this book, but it's also mentioned there, if I'm not mistaken, is that, what happens if you basically just cut off the water supply to some town? Like his argument was you would have chaos in like 2 weeks flat, like complete chaos. If no one could get to it, nobody could do anything about it. It would be a disaster. And I get his point, and in the abstract of his point, he's not wrong. Okay. So like this was definitely a guy who's like, okay, yeah, the future can be hopeful or it can get really, really bad, and really, really simple things could bring on that, the badness, shall we say. Okay. So yeah, like Gene Roddenberry was not just, all on optimism. Okay. But that's not even the big point, really to get into here. I think a lot of people point to, and I would say rightfully so, okay? They would point to the season finale of season 1 of Star Trek The Next Generation, which is so goddamn funny that season gets ripped on so hard. It is in my opinion, it's completely unjustified. Is it as good as some of the other stuff? In a conventional sense, maybe not. Like in a conventional sense, sure, it's not as good as season 3 or season 4. Okay. In a conventional sense, as to where, yay, action and all this other kind of stuff. But I've always said season 1 of Star Trek, which of course used a lot of scripts from, Star Trek Phase 2, which was supposed to be the before Star Trek the Motion Picture was being made. Star Trek Phase 2 was the television series that Paramount was going to use to launch a 4th television network in the US, which, you had CBS, ABC, NBC. Fox didn't exist at the time. So this was going to be a big deal that Paramount was going to make their own network. Of course, they would later do so in the 90s using Star Trek Voyager eventually with UPN. Okay, but that's all history. We don't have to worry about right this second. But yes, Star Trek Phase 2 was supposed to have Kirk and, not Kirk and Spock, Kirk and Zahn, and blah, 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 blah. All this history. Scripts from Star Trek Phase 2 were reused for Star Trek the Motion Picture. For Star Trek The Next Generation Season 1. And I think a lot of them work really well, even with the new cast. Okay, it does the job. in a lot of ways, Star Trek The Next Generation season 1 and season 2 are Gene Roddenberry's ultimate expression of what Star Trek was supposed to be. Now, I would say Star Trek the Motion Picture, which he also had very direct influence over, because Robert Wise, the director, great director of many movies, but of Star Trek the Motion Picture, thought that, like, okay, Gene Roddenberry's the guy. He's the person who understands Star Trek. He's the person that made Star Trek. So let's bring him in, and he's going to say, what's what, how this works. And to some people that ended up being with varying degrees of success, because there's still, sadly, a lot of Star Trek fans who think Star Trek the Motion Picture is boring. And of course, my response to them is always, no, your life is boring. Don't put that onto a movie. Like, don't blame your failings on a film. I'm sorry that your life sucks and that you need boom, boom, explosion all the time just to keep your fucking attention. Okay. But some of us are actually interested in really intellectual stories, which Star Trek the Motion Picture is. No shade at Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. I love that movie. But let's be clear here. Which one's real Star Trek? Yeah. Okay. So, gonna go to hell for that bit. So here's the point I want to make, and I'm going to get to that season 1 comment that I was leading up to. Okay, here's a very quick point that I need to make, and I've already done whole episodes on this matter. Gene Roddenberry only had influence on arguably the first 2 seasons of the original series, right? He quit the show, more or less, for season 3. Now, there's conversations to have how much direct influence did he have over season 1 and season 2 of the original series. Heavy debate to have on that. We'll talk about that. So season 1, season 2 of the original series, the animated series, he had, some options for control. And Star Trek the Motion Picture, none of the other movies, none of them. He didn't have any say whatsoever. I mean, like, they might have pretended to let him have some kind of say, but he didn't really have any say. And Star Trek The Next Generation season 1 and season 2. He had nothing to do with Deep Space Nine. As legend goes, he actually hated the idea of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, which is ironic considering that, and I understand why, and I respect this opinion completely, is that Star Trek Deep Space Nine is actually the best Star Trek. Like, I totally get that. I mean, that's not my opinion, but it's also one that I wouldn't argue against, or, that I'd argue about. Like, I get it. It's fucking awesome. So, this is the point, is that the only time that Gene was really allowed to, like, write the stories, have creative control, make creative decisions, things like this, were those exact moments. You basically have, like, 4, maybe 5 years of the entirety of Star Trek, of its entire history, that Gene had any sway. That's it. And I don't think most people realize this, because everybody gives Gene, like, all the credit. Now, some people will say to me, well, but Rick Berman, who was, Gene's underling for The Next Generation and then was in control of Star Trek after he died, that Rick Berman made sure that Gene Roddenberry's vision, like, it stayed Gene Roddenberry's vision. Now, there's reality and unreality within that. Okay. And the reason I say that is, like, yes, I think Rick Berman, did go to bat for some of the central precepts of what Gene Roddenberry wanted Star Trek to be. But then also, I think it's pretty clear there are moments where, like, I mean, just look, if it's true that Gene Roddenberry did not want Deep Space Nine to be a thing, okay, but Rick Berman greenlit it anyway. Like, is Rick Berman really defending Gene's wishes all the time? No. And I'm not even saying there's anything necessarily wrong with that. Okay. Because, some of the greatest moments of Star Trek came out under, Rick Berman's, purview. Awesome. And I mean, there's so many names under that, to like Jerry Taylor, Brandon Braga. I mean, like there's so many people that, that we could talk about. I mean, Ira Stephen Bear, and so on. That I'm not going to say anything nice about Ron Moore. But I mean, there's just, yeah, there's so many names involved underneath that. But, I just want to be clear on that. So, but that's the first thing you have to understand, is that if you think Star Trek is this great vision of Gene Roddenberry, I would argue 80%, and that might even be generous, of Star Trek had nothing to do with Gene. Nothing to do with Gene. Gene Roddenberry, that is. Gene L. Kuhn, on the other hand, oh, well, now things get a little more interesting. Okay, so let's talk about this. It really wasn't until after Gene Roddenberry died, we suddenly started to get some pretty heavy doses of reality in books. I mentioned Gene Roddenberry, The Last Conversation, that book by Yvonne Fern. Of course, that, was with Gene's literal direct input. Okay. But other books would come out over time at that time because it was a hot subject and Star Trek was the hot thing. The Next Generation was like the biggest show on the planet, in a very real way. So, you had a book called, Inside Star Trek, which was written by Herb Salow and Bob Justman, Herb Salow is basically the guy, just a little Jewish guy that made sure that Star Trek was a thing. As much as Lucille Ball is to be, and she is absolutely to be credited with Star Trek existing. Like, she was the person who said, yes, get that on Desilu Studios. This is before Paramount owned it. Herb Salow was that guy. Bob Justman, another, major name in making Star Trek, the original series, a thing. Okay. Herb Salow, Herb Salow, basically tells the story in Inside Star Trek. And actually there's a documentary that came out, it's not 20 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, something like that. A lot of it had Gene Roddenberry's son, Eugene, in it, called Trek Nation. It's actually a very good documentary to watch. It came out before Discovery and all this other stuff. It's worthwhile. I have the double disc DVD. It's really quite good. And it gives you the reality of like how Gene, like even during season 1 and season 2 of the original series, like you couldn't get him to print out, you couldn't get him to type up a story. Like there's a story, I think, where like Herb Salow had to actually like stand on Gene's desk at the Paramount lot and say, I am not getting off of this desk until you hand me a script. And Gene and Herb sat there, stood there. I mean, I know how obstinate Jews can get. Stories I could tell you about my dad, and my mom for that matter. I know how obstinate they could get, and I could picture it, and it's exactly what someone like that would do. And Gene just sat there and typed up a script. Now, when you're dealing with a person like that, how does anything get done? How does anything get made? Well, here's the reality. And Inside Star Trek, again, not just Inside Star Trek, but also Trek Nation, also corroborated a lot of this from other names. And we also have stories from other books that I'm going to get into, okay? Like by Joel Siegel, where Leonard Nimoy says, basically directly tells Robert Wise, okay, again, who directed Star Trek the Motion Picture, because originally they weren't going to be able to get Leonard Nimoy. He was like, no, I'm not interested in doing it. I'm not doing the pointy ears thing anymore, whatever. But eventually, like, Nimoy's like, oh, well, I want to work with Robert Wise. This is very exciting. Fiddler on the Roof, all this stuff. Like, okay, yeah, great. But then like he tells a story about this meeting that they have with Gene Roddenberry and like, what's the plan for Spock's character? And Gene Roddenberry, like, basically just has like this like bullshit answer that he comes out with, which part of it was used in the motion picture. But anyway, Nimoy, like is quoted as saying later to Robert Wise, like, you don't know what you're dealing with. Like, this isn't the guy. Like, Roddenberry's not the guy. So, so this is my point, is that in season 1 and season 2, what you actually had was a guy named Gene L. Coon. And in fact, Gene L. Coon had a tremendous, history in television at the time. In fact, one of his great successes was a show from 1957. No, not Maverick, though he did work on that as well, because again, everything was like a Western back then. He had success with scripts for a show called Wagon Train. Now, here's the rub. The legend, the myth of how Gene Roddenberry, pitched Star Trek, okay, to NBC, and whoever, we got to get this thing on the air. The legend is that the way that he sold a science fiction show, because science fiction was like hokey and not a huge deal, the way that he sold Star Trek to the studios was, it's a wagon train to the stars. Now, most people think that he just was talking about like a literal stagecoach, very common imagery for Westerns. But no, if you read the sentence, you should read it as wagon train, either in quotes or italics. He's talking about Gene L. Coon's show, Wagon Train, which was a show that when Gene L. Coon would write the scripts for it, would always have a moral at the end. In fact, if you watch Wagon Train, and I have, because I wanted to understand this more, like how did this, again, like I said, Star Trek is like 50% of me. So I want to understand it, right? So I watch this and I'm like, holy shit, like this is Star Trek just in the Old West. In a lot of ways, in story structure, it's that. Like, it's a moral story. I mean, you can find quotes like Scotty, James Doohan, is famous for saying that. Like, the great thing about Star Trek was that it was a moral story. Every episode had a moral at the end. That's Wagon Train. So when the pitch is Wagon Train to the Stars, they're literally talking about the work of Gene L. Coon. They're basically saying, yeah, we want to take what Gene L. Coon does and put it in space. Direct evidence of who the real brainchild here is. So, and Gene L. Coon, I mean, you can find out about this in Inside Star Trek. There's so many works now that talk about like all the contributions that Gene L. Coon made. I mean, this is the guy who promoted and defined the Prime Directive. Like, most people give Gene Roddenberry the credit for the Prime Directive. No, it was Gene L. Coon. We know this for a fact. Gene L. Coon's the one who, he created the Klingons, came up with the idea of the Organian Peace Treaty, like all this stuff. He came up with Khan for Space Seed, for the episode Space Seed, which if you do think Star Trek II is the greatest piece of Star Trek media ever, that doesn't exist without Space Seed, and Space Seed doesn't exist without the script of Gene L. Coon, or without the story ideas of the, shall we say, the teleplay maybe of Gene L. Coon. The list goes on and on. The idea that that Spock and McCoy constantly argue with each other, the bickering, right? That's Gene L. Coon's idea. So folks, even for season 1 and season 2, which Gene L. Coon left halfway through the filming of season 2, which is actually probably the real reason that Gene Roddenberry left, was because he's like, I'm not the idea guy. The other Gene is. Like this entire history of Gene Roddenberry being the guy who's like coming up with all the ideas, laying out all the shit in season 1 and season 2 and having that direct influence. History would suggest otherwise, that was not Roddenberry. That was actually Gene L. Coon. Like, the basic idea might have been Roddenberry's. But we're going to deconstruct that even more. Okay. We're going to get into this, and there's going to be stuff, I guarantee you, like I said, that you will rarely hear anywhere else. This is going to get into the mystical. I'm not kidding. I'm not exaggerating. So, and we know that Gene L. Coon and Gene Roddenberry would have arguments like that. That's verified. Okay. And part of the reason that Gene L. Coon left was because of an argument, particularly over the episode Bread and Circuses, if I'm not mistaken. So Gene Coon would still contribute scripts to season 3 of Star Trek. By the way, he had a pseudonym that he would use for it. But he would also be involved, still somewhat be involved within that. Of course, he would go on to do all other kinds of shows, after Star Trek. And just to, this is not uninteresting to me. Okay. In that I was shocked. Like, the thing that really turned me on to Gene Coon many, many years ago was Glenn Larson, or as my old friend and hero, Harlan Ellison, would call him, Glenn Larceny. I was always so annoyed when he'd say that. Anyway, I thought Glenn Larson was a genius. Come on, man. Fucking Battlestar Galactica, Buck Rogers, Knight Rider, just go down the list. Even the stuff later on, Nightman, man, this is good stuff. Battlestar Galactica is so brilliant on so many levels. I want to do an episode about it so bad because I think there's so much reality laid out in that show. Like, the goddess is speaking through that series. Not new BSG. Just like the goddess isn't speaking through New Trek. Okay. Not through new BSG, but through old Battlestar Galactica from 78 Galactica. Oh yeah, baby. Now, Glenn Larson famously said that the real brain, heart and soul of Star Trek was Gene Coon. Now, Gene Coon was basically Glenn Larson's mentor. Okay. So, it's not a hard stretch to say any flashes of brilliance you see in Glenn Larson's work. Like, a lot of that could have come from the brilliance that is Gene Coon. And Herb Sallow, who, again, was instrumental to Star Trek being a thing in the 60s, was behind so many other great Mission Impossible. I mean, so many hit shows. Like, this is a guy who knew talent, and he knew he needed Gene Coon. So, and Gene Roddenberry, I think, also knew that he needed Gene Coon because they would continue to work with each other. The Quester tapes, Gene Coon was a co-writer on that. He worked with Roddenberry on Genesis 2, which is absolutely worth a watch. That's a really, really cool. It was supposed to be a pilot for a new TV series, but Gene Roddenberry had a hard time selling new TV series, even though he'd get pilots because everybody's like, oh yeah, Star Trek's famous. Let's give this guy a shot. Anything he came up with just wouldn't land. And we're going to get into that. That's an important footnote. Like, we got to hang on to that. Okay. But this is, the whole reason I'm saying all of this is that even with, so like, if Gene Roddenberry's influence was only on season 1, season 2 of the original series, Star Trek the Motion Picture, and season 1 and season 2 of The Next Generation, I think it's not unfair, and I hate to do this, to say that his influence was also incredibly minimal in season 1 and season 2 of the original series. And that most of the, cornerstone ideas of Star Trek, even from the original series, like the Prime Directive, were not his ideas. Okay, so we're demystifying here. Now, that's not to say he had no influence, but let's just be clear here that the influence is far more minimal within that. Okay, and I know I haven't talked about the cage, and maybe there's something to bring up within that, but but we, again, season 1, season 2, the original series, it's Gene Coon, Herb Sallow, and DC Fontana doing all the hard work. Lots of other names, yes, but Gene's influence, minimal. Now, so we're getting past those years, but there will be an important point later to bring in with with the original series. Okay, that we'll get to when we have a point, we have a thing, we have almost a whole chapter of a book that I want to read to you, to explore this more. Okay. So, but now in the timeline, okay, Gene Roddenberry leaves Star Trek, before it ultimately gets canceled with season 3. And so what's he doing in the meantime? Well, we mentioned the Quester tapes, Genesis 2, he even did it was supposed to be a pilot, ended up being just a TV movie called Spectre that also starred his wife, Michelle Barrett Roddenberry. And, which by the way, Michelle Barrett Roddenberry, can confirm a lot of, these stories and she would be the one to know. So he had a string of failed TV movies. Look, bottom line, like Paramount gave him kind of a permanent desk, office, it would seem, just because I guess he was a known quantity, whatever the reasons happen to be. But he had a string of failures. He did not have another success. In fact, I mean, just right now, I would argue, what other success has he had that you can think of? Now, the easy things to point at are Earth Final Conflict and Andromeda. 2 shows that both got at least 5 seasons, I think. Earth Final Conflict definitely got 5 seasons. I think Andromeda was also 5 seasons. Don't watch the 5th season of Earth Final Conflict. But otherwise that show, at least at first, was actually pretty cool. Like I really enjoyed season 1 a lot. And Andromeda, I also enjoyed that very much. But that, whatever, we don't need to get lost on those. But all of those were made off of like script ideas that he had, but were developed posthumously without his input. It's not him. Okay. Just like there was a comic book series that like 3 issues. It was called Gene Roddenberry's Lost Universe. It was really cool. Had some cool ideas in it. But again, it was posthumous. Like it wasn't him. Based on a spec script or something like that, or a little story idea. Maybe it's based on a couple sentences or a paragraph. I don't know. But it's not him. So pointing at other successes besides Star Trek, what do you got? I don't like saying this because I idolized the guy for a huge chunk of my life. But we need to go over this. And part of the importance of this demystification, this demythologizing of Gene Roddenberry is like, you've got all these people who, at least through lip service, are claiming to like uphold Gene Roddenberry's vision. But was it Gene Roddenberry's vision? What the fuck even is Gene Roddenberry's vision? Like, what are you guys talking about? And if they don't know, how can they, if they don't know the actual history of Gene Roddenberry, and I would argue they don't, otherwise they'd stop using his fucking name all the time. Okay. like really, how can you actually understand what Star Trek is really all about? So this is where we're at. We're in the 70s. We're in the 1970s, and Gene Roddenberry is having failure after failure after failure. And I'm not saying what he made was bad. I would actually argue the opposite. I enjoyed the Quester tapes. I enjoyed Genesis 2. Planet Earth was the second movie that he kept trying to redo that idea with that Genesis 2 was of like this post-apocalyptic Earth. So he made another one called, was it Planet Earth? Then he did Strange New World, which, not a surprise that he, drug out that line, but it had nothing to do with Star Trek, or at least, not with the original idea. And I enjoy all of these things. I'm just saying that like they weren't hits. They weren't successes by any measure. So, but at the same time, like he is, enjoying this legendary status among Star Trek fans, that new Star Trek fans that are coming out of Star Trek, the original series, being in syndication for years and being a wild success there. Star Trek, the original series, got done dirty during its original 3-season run. It got moved to different time slots, all this other stuff. They didn't have like the Nielsen metrics that would become a standard for television for decades, yet. At that point, so, they couldn't really track just how successful Star Trek was. And so again, it got done dirty. I'm not arguing that didn't happen. And when it was running in syndication on other networks, it became this, whole new monstrosity, unavoidable monstrosity. And I say monstrosity in a positive sense. And conventions, Star Trek conventions started happening, and he was going to them and he was speaking at them and, saying all of these wild ideas. Were they his ideas? Well, here's another thing to understand. So he's becoming this really big name by default because of 3 seasons of Star Trek. He is becoming this, big name in science fiction. And so he ends up becoming friends with Ray Bradbury, with Isaac Asimov, and potentially with some other characters. Because the claims, and this is where it becomes a little tough to get the evidence on this, but the claims are that he ends up becoming a member of the AMORC, okay, which of course is that stands for the Ancient Mystical Order of the Rosy Cross. So it's Rosicrucian. And, they have their main headquarters are in San Jose, California. Okay. Which of course, Roddenberry lives in California. Other members supposedly of this group are Walt Disney, Leonard Cohen. So again, the evidence around that, might end up getting a little bit sparse, but he is a member of this. Now, this is going to become important. Because while we can't necessarily find a lot of evidence that he was part of the AMORC, he was a very mystical thinker. Another one of his friends would be Charles Musset, who was really big, like kind of this like new age shaman kind of guy, very brilliant person. If you read his books, like on chronotopography, I'm not going to say I agree with his works, but I'm also not going to call him an idiot. By no means am I going to call him an idiot. This is a very deep thinker. Okay. And this is what happens is Gene Roddenberry finds himself surrounded by a lot of very deep thinkers. And this myth, this mystique ends up building around him to the point, and this is where we're going to get into we're going to do some reading. Okay. So I hope you're ready for this. I know you probably weren't expecting this to be a 2-hour plus opus. Okay. But, but we're going to get in some reading, on this is another book that would end up coming out in the mid-90s.
To be continued in part 2 of Fallen Star, The Death of New Trek and the Myth of Gene Roddenberry. Dr. Sovryn will see you on the next episode of ST-1.